get the program started. We have a big and very interesting panel today, so we want to maximize the amount of time we have for the speakers to actually present. So I'm going to get started a little bit early. Feel free to keep eating. I can handle the clanking. Just going to go through some of our introductions. I am Janice Starzyk of ILS, the current president of the Washington Space Business Roundtable. Thank you all for coming for this very exciting event. This is the first time, as far as I know, and I've been part of this organization for about 10 years, that we have ever sold out for a lunch. So thank you all for being here, and I'm glad you all got a seat, and I apologize to any of your colleagues who did not. However, for the first time, we are teaming with SpaceNews, where they are going to be recording this lunch. And, sorry, is this better? Can you hear me? They're going to be recording the lunch, and they'll be posting it to their website on Monday. So anyone who was not able to attend could still get to experience the panel. We have a special introducer today. As part of the webinar series with SpaceNews, there is a sponsor associated with that, and Boeing was kind enough to sponsor this webinar, make the keepsake of this lunch for posterity, and the webinar that will be presented next week a possibility. So I'm going to bring up Jeff Traberman from Boeing to introduce the panel.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming by. Well, I want to thank the Washington Space Business Roundtable for putting this event on, and of course our colleagues over at SpaceNews for this terrific event. Boeing is, of course, delighted to be a sponsor of this event and this great panel. The title of today's discussion, Commercial Perspective, Wideband Global Satellite Systems and What Comes Next, is particularly apt. We at Boeing are very proud, of course, of our role in the Wideband Global Satellite Program and the work we've done for our customers on that. Yet we realize the future is going to involve a much more robust mix of commercial and military satellite communications that will be addressed by a number of our panelists here. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say how delighted we are to actually be working with a number of our panelists. They are our customers. We're building commercial solutions that will carry them and us long into the future, and we're very, very proud of that. So without further ado, I will say thank you again on behalf of the Boeing Company. I think my job next is to introduce the moderator of today's panel, which is Warren Ferster, a great friend, a great colleague, an expert as the editor-in-chief of SpaceNews. So Warren, thank you very much for your role in this, and we look forward to a great luncheon discussion today. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a very, very kind, to say the least, introduction. Just a quick reminder, thanks again to Jeff and Boeing for sponsoring the webcast, and just a reminder, this is being filmed, so in case anybody didn't notice or was contemplating saying something crazy. So as Jeff pointed out, the panel discussion is entitled Commercial Satcom Support to the U.S. Defense Department, Commercial Perspective on the future of military satellite communications after WGS. As I'm sure most of you know, the WGS is the backbone of the U.S. military satellite communications fleet, and it serves a customer set that the commercial satellite operators believe that they can serve at a lower cost to the U.S. government. What's interesting here is that we don't know what the future holds for WGS. The Pentagon's been sending mixed signals on this, to say the least. But what we do know is that there are 5 WGS, am I correct here, Jeff? I'm sorry, 6 WGS satellites on orbit, with 4 more on order. They're designed to last, again, help me out here, Jeff, 15 years apiece? 15 years apiece. So that's a lot of bandwidth that's going to be on orbit for a long time. So that's something to be reckoned with. So I'd like to ask the panelists to come on up here if they could, please. And they're going to offer their perspective on all of this. So to my immediate right, we have, these are all satellite operators, by the way, all representing satellite operators. To my right, we have Philip Harlow. He's the President and Chief Operating Officer of XStar. To his right is Peter Hadinger, President of the U.S. Government Business Unit of Inmarsat. Next is Scott Butler, Vice President of Satellite Networks and Space Services at Intelsat General. Then we have David Baer, President of Eutelsat America. And then last but not least, Tip Osterthaler, President and Chief Executive of SES Government Solutions. What we're going to do here is we're going to give each of the panelists about 2 minutes to wax eloquent on a theme that's relevant to today's topic. And then after that, we'll launch into some Q&A and discussion, which I will lead. And just as a reminder to the audience, we're going to set aside hopefully about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So we're going to begin with Philip, who will discuss the challenges and potential improvements to the U.S. government's Satcom acquisition and management practices. Philip?
Good afternoon, everybody. We've actually already answered this question. So about 2 years ago, most of the companies on this panel here and one or two others got together and wrote a paper called The 7 Ways for DoD to be a Better Buyer of Commercial Satcom, colloquially known as the 7 Ways paper. And in that paper, we put together 7 distinct actions that DoD could take, different things that they could change in terms of policy and practice that would result in significant reductions in the cost of buying commercial Satcom. Because quite frankly, over the years, we've heard from DoD, commercial Satcom is too expensive. And when you compare the numbers of the admitted $9.7 billion spent on 10 spacecraft at WGS, I can tell you that as a commercial satellite operator, if we got $9.7 billion, we'd have an awful lot more satellites than 10 in the sky. And there are some differences, of course, in the spacecraft, but essentially the same types of services are being offered. But these 7 ways, over time, the discussion has changed a little bit, but 3 of those are still important and still things that we need to consider. First is that DoD has to be a smarter buyer. Now, I know the CIO's report has come out and it said that they cannot buy for multi-year, but we have to find a way to make that happen. So maybe Tip will talk about that in just a little bit, but we need to find a way for DoD to be a smarter buyer. The second is that we are consistently talking to 7 or 8 different entities within DoD about commercial Satcom, about military Satcom. And most of the satellite operators have their major customers as the broadcast community, and we talk to 1 or 2 people in those companies and we make very important decisions very quickly. And we need to find a way to get away from the 10-year decision cycle that we have in DoD. And I had a third way, but I kind of lost my thread there a little bit. But there are significant steps that can be taken by DoD. They must be taken to enable them to save money. The major problem we have, though, is that there is some inertia in DoD. And the other thing is that it does not serve all of their interests for there to be a greater reliance on commercial. They prefer to have their own systems, and when they come out with numbers about the costs and about the effectiveness, you have to look at those numbers in the light of what serves their interests. And they may not always align with those of commercial industry.
Thanks, Philip. Next up is Peter, who will discuss an integrated architectural approach to government and commercial Satcom systems.
Well, I thought before I did that and before I forgot, I wanted to say a special thank you to Nicole Robinson and to Andrew Duva for the work that they do with us in helping to organize things like this, as well as to organize the industry's viewpoints as they're expressed in things like the 7 Ways paper. And all of us get together, we come from different backgrounds and have different points of view on many of these, but a number of these actually coalesce into common position points. The thing I wanted to raise here was actually related to one of the premises of this particular topic, which was subtitled, What Comes Beyond WGS? And this was sort of how I heard it on WTOP, at least. And I would ask that this not be considered what comes after WGS, because that's going to be around for another 20 years or so as a constellation, even with the satellites that are currently in the shop. But what we do while we have WGS, it's really about how we come up together with government with an integrated architecture that combines both the best of what government satellites can do and the best of what commercial satellites can do to solve real problems that they have all over the world. And the right answer is not necessarily to spend more money on building more satellites on either the commercial side or the government side, but to figure out how to make best use of the satellite resources that already exist. In some cases, these are satellite resources like the ones that we're making that are aligned in spectrum bands and so forth with where the government satellites are, but that's not necessarily the case in all of these systems. And in fact, one of the easiest things that can be done is to have terminals which are capable of tuning into one or more different bands to be able to operate across both commercial and military resources. These are things that don't require new launches and new capabilities to accomplish, yet would go a long way toward improving the interoperability of these systems and reducing the cost to the government of using commercial where it's most best used, which is in filling between the gaps where the government satellites have focused on their capacity. So I really would like to see our discussions move not from a one or the other, but to how together we can actually do this in a way that makes the best sense for the taxpayer and for the warfighters and other users who rely on government satellite communications writ large.
Thanks, Peter. Next, we have Scott, whose theme is the availability of more resilient, higher throughput commercial satellite capabilities to support government users in increasingly contested space environments.
I'm pretty sure I didn't write that. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here for Kay, and I was glad to agree to step in, although once I realized it was streaming, she's probably watching from the airport now, and so anything that I forget to say and point that she would have foot stomped, I'll be in trouble for later, so you guys can send cards. What I really wanted to do is start with something that Admiral Bien wrote in SpaceNews back in the spring, and it was about protection. And what he said essentially was that in the DoD, protection is a defined term, and that we as commercial operators and others in our industry need to be careful running around talking about how we can offer protection the same as the government systems can. And so I wanted to preface my remarks by saying we acknowledge that. I acknowledge that is the case. What I'd like to do is suggest that we change the conversation a bit and talk about protection differently. Talk about it as a range of things that can be done and layers that can be put onto spacecraft, and including commercial spacecraft. And if you look at the kinds of things that we do today to offer assured communications, because really that's what we're talking about, right? We want to make sure that the data gets through. We have command encryption on our satellites as an industry, not completely across the board. We're about 80% of our fleet in all new satellites, and I think all the operators for new satellites, command encryption. Telemetry encryption is coming as well. We've had steerable beams for decades in some cases where we can operate in a contested environment. That wasn't the original purpose for the design, but certainly they can be steered away from jammers and things like that. New architectures have spot beams. Inmarsats, EPICs, SES has announced. The more spot beams enable you to at least isolate where a jammer is coming from. And although as a commercial business entity, we may not be able to do something about it, others may, our customers may, and it gives them greater opportunity and greater knowledge. Wider transponders, protected waveforms that are being developed. This is a solution that's being developed on the ground that SMC is developing, but guess what? They want to know how to use those over commercial systems as well, not just over the military systems. And they've asked and engaged us as an industry to tell them how we would do that. What would be our concept of operations to employ protected waveforms in a commercial environment? So we have opportunities. And I think I'll stop there for the moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Next up is Dave, who's going to talk about the role of hosted payloads in supporting government requirements.
Thank you. One of the most positive things, I think, to come out of all the discussions we've had recently in the press and in back rooms is the renewed emphasis on hosted payloads and kind of by extension the Pathfinder program. And I say renewed because hosted payloads have been around for a long, long time.
Sorry, Dave, could you try to speak in the microphone, please?
I'll try. So I'm not loud enough this way? Okay. Ted can hear me, I know that. So anyway, the renewed interest on hosted payloads, I think, is good for all of us. And they have been around for a long time. I remember about 15 years ago working at Lockheed, doing a study for NASA on a hosted payload. I think the problem is it's only recently come out that I think they're going to launch that one or put that one up for bid. But the WAAS, the Wide Area Augmentation System, those have been flying for a long time. And all of our companies have actually had some access or some interest in hosted payloads up to now. I know with the UHF payload for Intelsat, the CHIRP payload, the highly successful CHIRP payload for SES, and even Eutelsat for the European Space Agency is about to fly a thing called EDRS, European Data Relay System, which is a laser comm system. So hosted payloads have been around for a long time. And I think with the renewed emphasis on costs and budget cutting and things like that, it does provide the government with a very economical way to get into space. You're not buying a whole satellite, you're not buying a whole rocket to get it there. And there's a lot of other companies out there that are offering services to get small payloads to space as well. Now, so far, these hosted payloads have primarily been sensors and not telecoms, as we're mostly here to talk about today. And one of the ways to get into that, I think, as mentioned in some of these reports, is also the Pathfinder program. And today, that's not really a hosted payload, but some of the future Pathfinders certainly look like hosted payloads because they will be basically subsets of the payload, or even in some cases the entire payload. Call it hosted, call it whatever you want, but it's a way to do that. So again, those are things that the commercial groups are very interested in doing. I think a lot of people in the government, whether it's NASA, sensors, and even telecoms people on the DoD side are interested in as well. And if there's, it seems like with the Hosted Payload Alliance conference that just successfully concluded last week, I think there's a lot of renewed interest in that, and I think it can go a long way in helping government reduce spending and making a lot of other people in the government and in the commercial industry happy. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Finally, Tip is going to talk about legislative and budget issues and opportunities.
Thanks, Warren. Before I start, I'd like to convey my condolences. The Naval Academy will likely not win the Commander-in-Chief Trophy this year. And I'll hold my condolences for you for next Monday, Dave. We'll get ahead of ourselves.
Yes, sir.
So I guess I was asked to talk about legislative budget issues because I didn't respond to the emails and everybody else picked off on the other topics. Or it may have been because I spent 28 years on the government side of this and presumably understand more about those things as a result of that experience. I'm not sure that's actually true. But it is kind of encouraging, to me at least, having watched from both the government side and the industry side these kinds of debates for a number of years, that there do seem to be some things happening that weren't happening before that are potentially pretty positive. The first comment I'll make, I guess, from my government experience is, look, change is really hard. So I thought maybe there was a fire alarm. So
Lock that, please.
Change truly is hard. I mean, I was inside the system for a long time, and trying to change something as fundamental as what we're talking about here rarely happens from within an institutional framework which is as defined and rigid and constrained as the government procurement framework is. The only way it typically happens is if there's a huge crisis or some very senior person has enough time to kind of force change from the top down. Otherwise, it doesn't happen very easily. We saw in the recently released DoD report reaction to a lot of these discussions about changed business models. There were some good features to that. There were some that were a little bit resistant to change. But what we're seeing from the Hill and from other participants in this discussion is a little bit more forward-leaning sort of approaches. And I find that pretty encouraging. Pathfinders, David mentioned, are a way to explore alternative business models to kind of change the way we define the problem. If we continue to define the problem of as a lease versus buy problem, it seems to be going nowhere. Trying to convince the Department of Defense or the U.S. government that they ought to encourage long-term leasing for what they consider to be services is probably a loser. I mean, long-term leasing for services is generally probably not a good idea. So these Pathfinder models actually change the conversation. They talk about bringing acquisition money, procurement money, structuring long-term programs, palming the money that you need to do these things rather than doing them on annually appropriated funds. Those are very positive. And Congress, in many ways, is sort of leading the charge there. Two congressmen in particular, Congressman Jim Bridenstine of Oklahoma and Mike Rogers of Alabama, have become engaged on the House side at trying to encourage the reformers that do exist within DoD, and there are some, to craft enabling legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act. Over the last 2 years, we've had some encouraging signs, and we expect to see more in the next couple of budgets. But those are all very, very positive because it enables the people who are willing to champion change in DoD to be bold and to actually do things without getting their legs kicked out from under them. A lot of people, both in DoD, not a lot of people, some people in DoD and a lot of people on the Hill probably are challenging the conventional approaches. Encouraging, one of the most positive individual developments here is this encouragement of the issue that Peter brought up about defining kind of a single architecture which identifies key roles for both the Satcom providers and the Satcom providers, because it is absolutely true that neither is the total solution to the problem. Each has an important role to play. We simply can't afford probably as many MilSat systems as we would like. We need to find a way to leverage the ComSat investments that are made out there. I mean, just my company alone has probably between $15 and $20 billion worth of hardware orbiting around today. It's not particularly well optimized or utilized by U.S. government, but it could be if we're a little bit smarter about how we plan. I would just, I guess, conclude by saying one of the encouraging developments just in the last few days in the released DoD report, it seems to sort of accept the notion that the National Defense Authorization language, which is moving forward right now, hopefully in the FY15 budget, encourages a pilot program to leverage the working capital fund to serve as a test bed for new business models. That's pretty encouraging. I mean, that's not something that we would have talked about even a year or two ago. It's not done yet. But to find DoD and the Congress converging on a couple elements of a broader and potentially more effective strategy, I think is a very positive development. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tip. So I had an initial question all queued up for everybody, but I wanted to pick up on something that you said at the beginning of your remarks, Tip. I believe I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't think that long-term leases are a good idea. Is that what you said? Because that's a little surprising to me, because that's been one of the major themes that we've heard from the commercial satellite operators over the year, that the Pentagon actually should be doing this.
It's not what I intended to say. What I intended to say, if I did say that, was long-term leases are not going to solve the problem. I think they are a good idea, but the problem with long-term leases is the problem we're trying to solve here, in my view, is a different problem than the long-term lease discussion addresses. That's a question about whether or not you ought to change the way you acquire services. And my view has always been, and many of you have heard me say this, that's not what we're doing here. We're not buying janitorial services here. We're buying access to global communications infrastructure using multiple award IDIQs with 1-year base periods and 4 one-year options. No matter how effectively you do it, is still the wrong process. So, yeah, I think longer-term leases are better than shorter-term leases, but I don't think they really change the game, because most people don't think that service acquisition as a general proposition is broken, and I'm not sure I disagree with that. I think the problem is what we're buying here is not really bathroom services. It's access to global infrastructure, and we need a different approach. I think the Pathfinder approaches are maybe more promising.
Do any of the other panelists have a strong opinion on that?
I think Tip's right. Yes, long-term leasing solves a problem. It's an immediate problem, but it doesn't address the long-term structural issues with procuring space segment.
I guess I would say, the long-term leases provide some level of incentive to a commercial business to invest. But what's more important is this unified architecture idea. I think knowing that there's a bigger play and a bigger picture down the road that really values the contribution that you're bringing to the total architecture, I think is what we're really interested in. Yes.
And tying that in to the infrastructure, these are not 5-year, 1-year assets. It takes 3 to 5 years to develop a satellite and build it, and then it's on orbit for 15. So if you're not thinking for the long term, a slightly longer term lease is not going to solve the problem.
Wanted to just pick up, unless Peter, did you have anything that you, I didn't want to cut you off there?
I was just going to say that sometimes it doesn't mean having to make positive investments on the government side, but just choosing where not to invest, and to let that be known to industry that the government's going to go over here, and this is what the government's going to do, but the government is going to choose not to invest over here. That allows commercial markets to make a conscientious business decision that that's in fact what we will do in a competitive fashion, so it remains an open playing field. But nonetheless, it does give some additional certainty to the market that those are places, in fact, we can go in and be profitable.
Thanks. So the DoD just recently came out with a report that says that commercial satellite bandwidth costs the government 4 times more than comparable bandwidth acquired over commercial satellites. Over the WGS system. We've heard this before, but that was a pretty strong statement. And I suspect that some of you or all of you have opinions about that. So anybody want to respond to that?
I don't know how aggressive everybody wants to be on this one, because this is one of those loaded questions, I'm sure. So I'll take the first shot.
You're warned.
I'm waiting for the Air Force to protect me on this one, though. So, no, I think this is one of those things where we have to see exactly what is being evaluated, what is being analyzed. We really don't have a whole lot of insight into those numbers. I think in general, most of at this table agree with the number put out there for the commercial capacity. I think those numbers are roughly in line with what we see the government paying for that capacity. But for what a WGS system costs and how you utilize it is a big open question that we really haven't seen what comes out of that. I mean, if you just do a couple back of the envelope numbers and say a satellite like that costs $1 billion and it's got 4.875 gigahertz of rough bandwidth, and you divide that by 15 years and you divide that by 12 months, and you assume 100% utilization for that entire 15 years, you get to a number, I think, that comes close to what was in that report. But again, we have not, that's my analysis. That's not an analysis based on a lot of information we've seen on how they came, or how that number was arrived, or where that number was arrived at. So before we actually say anything, start criticizing, I think it's fair to ask for the data that backs up that provided the number in that analysis. And then if we want to, we can throw stones. Again, I think that's not the main question we're here to answer. We're here to answer what is the best way to go forward with providing communication services to the government and the Department of Defense. And it will, long term, involve both military and commercial assets. So, before we do throw stones, we criticize, we need to have all the facts in there. I personally think it's a very unrealistic number, but I can't really criticize it until I know what it was based on.
Did anybody else want to chime in on that?
I think I'll take a somewhat more philosophical crack at it without getting into the specific numbers, which of course depend greatly on the terms that you use to frame the question. I would just observe that all of us in this room, or at least most of us, probably own a car, and we use that car to drive from our homes to our offices, get groceries and so forth in our neighborhood. Yet when we all fly someplace, we don't own a car at LAX or any of the other places we might descend into. We go and we rent a car there because it's actually less expensive to go and rent it in all these different places we go. You can't afford to own a car everywhere. In fact, if you tried to figure out what it would cost to rent a car every single day and operate it out of your driveway, it would be a rather expensive thing to do. And so, in fact, there is a proper match for where it makes most sense to own and where it makes most sense to rent. And in many ways, the commercial market has the benefit of being able to spread the cost over lots and lots of different buyers who actually have different times that they need to use our resources. And the government can leverage the fact that we're willing to build infrastructure and have those rental cars sitting at airports all over the place for them to come along and use as and when and where they need them. Yes, it costs more if you tried to figure it out on a dollar per day sense, but overall, the government would save money by being able to go to the commercial market, use what it needs, when it needs it, where it needs it, and ultimately return it back to where it came from when they're done, than to necessarily go down that path themselves. So I think it's a bit of a false argument to try to get into a specific dollars and cents comparison on a per megahertz or per day basis. At the end of the day, it should be an integrated architecture in which commercial plays a defined role, and I think one that commercial can serve very well because of the fact that we serve so many markets besides just the DoD.
Phil, did you have anything to
Yeah,
add to that?
certainly the analysis seems to be the best possible case on one side being compared to the worst possible case on the other side. If DoD don't become a smarter buyer, the costs are always going to be high. You know, what we're concerned with as satellite operators is having capacity in the sky where DoD needs it, of a flavor, as Tip was talking about, of a flavor that is best suited to military operations. DoD is unhappy with the cost of that. But frankly, DoD is a fairly poor partner when it comes to planning what capacity to put where. They don't do these long-term leases. They don't sit with us and plan what type of capacity, where they're going to need it, what connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've talked about architecture a number of times here, and I think it's very pertinent that we need to be a better partner for DoD, and they need to be a better partner for us. And it's only together that we can figure out what the big picture needs to be, where we're going to put our investments so that the next time we go to war, the next time we deploy, we're going to be there to support them.
I think, I'm sorry, Ted, you wanted to?
Yeah, so I promised my friends from Boeing a couple of years ago I would never again give a speech saying WGS was a colossal waste of money, so I won't say that. I will say, though, that I actually consider this report very good news, this 4 times as expensive, because when I first entered this conversation with the same people, they told me it was 8 times expensive, more expensive, and probably more. That was in 2007. In 2010, we had a meeting with the same people who authored this section of the report, and they told us it was 6 times as expensive. And now we've worn them down to 4 times as expensive. So I think we're going the right direction, and I wouldn't worry too much about this. Stay out of the way, and we'll get it down to a reasonable number.
So the solution's another report, 2 years. Well, in all seriousness, you know, 4 times as expensive does create an impression upon some very impressionable people. And I'm wondering if there's anything that the industry can do to counteract that message. You can say, well, I have to see the methodology, or wow, they kind of loaded this, you know, they cooked the books here, but is there anything that the industry can do together to put out, to counter that message, I guess? I mean, can you go to a lawmaker and have the GAO look into this, something like that?
Yeah, since I was last on the last one with frivolous remarks, let me make a serious remark on this one. Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama has already come up publicly and said, look, this is an apples to oranges comparison. It really doesn't inform the dialogue very much. People are listening. They understand the limitations of these assumptions that go into these cost models and so forth, and they're not deterred by them. We're still, you know, I think it's important for us to move on from this part of the discussion. There are a lot of other things to talk about. The people who are convinced that everything needs to be Satcom are not going to be argued out of that by a different set of assumptions. I think everybody understands that there are differing points of view on this. Both Satcom and Satcom are essential parts of the future architecture, and that's what we ought to be dealing with, not arguing. I mean, WGS is done. I mean, it's out of the barn. People are saying there's probably not going to be a WGS follow-on. If we get into a dialogue about a WGS follow-on, then maybe it's relevant and we have to figure out what the real comparative costs are, but it's really kind of irrelevant at this point. We need both. WGS costs whatever it costs. We ought to think about how can we integrate an architecture that includes WGS and Satcom, because neither one of them solves the problem by itself anyway.
Okay, I'm going to bring up one more thing in the report, but I think it's more along the themes of the discussion. They said that make sure I get this word this correctly. It said the Pentagon still lacks a reliable means of predicting demand for commercial bandwidth in future years. Do you all agree with that or disagree with that assessment? And if you agree, what can be done about that?
I'd like to respond to that. Not to play the middle of the road, but I think it depends. The answer is kind of mixed. So there are long-term enduring requirements globally, and we know what they are, and we could list 10 of them if we sat up here and just threw out the names of what those networks are. Certainly, we know what those are. There are sort of the midterm, which I would call follow the terminal. So while we didn't predict Afghanistan, once we were in there with the footprint that we had, we certainly knew it wasn't going to be a short duration. And since we can put up new capability pretty quickly, we can react to those kinds of things. So I think there's some planning that could be done around that. The final element that's really hard to predict is around the flare-ups and the surge requirements for things that we, as a country, truly don't know that are going to happen and can't really predict precisely. But guess what? What's on orbit and what's going on orbit is also getting more and more flexible, and we can respond. Again, if we know we have a partner for the long term, we can be more prepared to respond to those things as well. So.
Well, certainly it's a fact that the DoD already predicts what they're going to need for the next 10, 15, 20 years because they use that data to decide that they're going to build WGS and more WGS. So they don't know exactly what they need, they don't know exactly where they'll need it, but they've got a prediction of bandwidth growth, they've got a prediction of the applications and tools that are going to be out there, and they use that. And you might say that sometimes they just roll the dice on a little bit of uncertainty, but they certainly have done that. And there's no need to say that for commercial it has to be very different or has to be more detailed. When you're spending billions of dollars on a satellite fleet, you need to have some business plan to back that up. And the basis of that business plan is always what is the demand. And DoD have already made those assessments, and they use them in their procurement of funds to build those satellites.
I think we would certainly agree with the government's assessment that it's notoriously hard to predict. I was with a market analyst yesterday who said that of all the different markets they analyze, government Satcom market is by far the most chaotic and most difficult to predict. And if that was the only market that we serve, that would be a big issue. But I think the thing that levels it for us in the commercial markets is that government does represent an important component of what we do, but it is not everything that we do. And because of that, we can actually make investments which are based on a much larger base of business, significantly more predictable and understandable than how the budget and, quite frankly, the event-driven realities of government life are. And the government can take advantage of the fact that the commercial industry can, in fact, flywheel through by using all of these other different markets as a way to fund the satellite systems that the government would not otherwise be able to fund themselves, because we are, in fact, there when they need them. We, as a company at Inmarsat, have satellites that truly cover the globe, and so for us, there's no pivot to this area or pivot to that area. It's only a question under which satellite services are configured and provided. And so for us, when we look at this, we never make our decisions in terms of the investment purely around what the government forecasts might be, knowing that they're really not worth a whole lot in that regard. We add some into the forecast, but our forecasts are really driven by the broader commercial market into which government plays an important and necessary but not dominant fraction.
Somebody else?
So that was on the prediction side. I think on the utilization side, I would say no, there is not an adequate system in place today to evaluate how the bandwidth procured, whether it's MilSatcom or ComSatcom, is evaluated or is utilized. We've even received questions effectively saying, can you tell us how much of the bandwidth we have bought from you are we using? So there's no reason for that. I mean, all the data is out there, but there's not really, and it'll come back to, I think, another theme later in the conversation, of a central clearinghouse for the use and the utilization, and are you getting the bang for your buck? Are you using what you have effectively, whether it's on the MilSatcom or the ComSatcom side?
Where, as commercial operators, and obviously pointed out that it's notoriously hard to predict, but where, if you look out in your crystal ball, where do you see the opportunity? Is it geographically based? Is it application based, such as mobile? Where do you see the biggest opportunity for you out there to support the government customer? Anybody who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll take one shot at it. I'm sure others will have used this as well. The growth and demand of bandwidth is inexorable. I mean, it's just a reality of our business. I spent the last 2 days with government customers at a government site and came to the conclusion that the airborne ISR mission right now is crushing the government's communications infrastructure, operational communications infrastructure, just crushing it. So if anybody thinks the demand is going to go away and we're going to decide we don't need as much of that, yeah, I think you're wrong. I think the demand, if anything, it's accelerating. The capabilities that we have with the, sensors that are being developed now and the platforms that they ride on is just astonishing. Now the problem is moving the data to where it can be used quickly. So, I don't think we need to worry about the growth in demand. Predicting exactly where it's going to happen and when it's going to happen is a little bit tougher. But, we know it's going to grow, and we need to make investments. The investment that a lot of people are making now, certainly Peter's company and most of the FSS operators are investing in high-throughput platforms. That's to help serve that demand, but also to drive down the cost per bit to where the government can get the capabilities it needs at a price that it's more likely to be able to afford. So there are technical developments. It's still hard to predict when and where, although we have a national strategy, that focuses increasingly on the Asia-Pacific region. That's a pretty good hint that we're probably going to need more capacity out there at some point. So there are clues, but there are also sort of inexorable trends that we can be reacting to and we should be reacting to, and many of us are reacting to.
Anyone else?
I think the other key area for us has been mobility, and that is continues to be an important factor for the government, and it's not just local mobility in terms of taking off and moving around a country, but in fact the ability to deploy globally on short notice. And that's becoming increasingly the case as the interactions we have are of the smaller unit variety, and on shorter notice we see this spot demands coming and going all the time around the world. And to be able to react to that and have something where people can have something they can train with, not knowing exactly where they're going to deploy to, and have that capability there when they get there is, at the end of the day, the thing that the government needs most. And for us, I think as commercial operators, the most that we can do to try to help the government make good use of commercial Satcom infrastructure, whether it's by having terminals that operate interactively across both government and commercial resources to be able to take advantage of the resources that are there when they get there, and to do the planning ahead of time to know what resources they can actually touch and have the contractual vehicles in place to touch it quickly, are all part of solving these kind of problems.
Anybody else?
I would just add, agree with both of those things, but critical would be the manned portion of the aero environment. And to Peter's point about quickly deploying, the ability to have that whole communication suite available and all that throughput available to you en route from A to B as you're deploying is critical and an opportunity space.
Thanks. So currently, and somebody alluded to this in their remarks, but currently the DoD Satcom requirements are divided in two shops. You've got SMC, which is, you have Space Command, which develops the requirements, and then SMC goes out and buys satellites. Then you have DISA, which procures commercial bandwidth. So responsibility for meeting DoD requirements is in two shops. I've heard some suggestions here that perhaps it should be consolidated into a single shop. Is there general agreement on that? And if so, where should it be? What form should that take?
Well, certainly DISA and SMC, Air Force Space Command, perform vital functions, and the skill sets don't overlap very much. No, I don't think any of us have ever suggested that one or the other should step aside and allow the other agency to take over responsibility for all of that. What I think we've been talking about over the years has been that when you look at the entire space, when you build this architecture, and it's a combination of military satellites and commercial satellites, nobody has really been in a position to A, articulate what that architecture is or should be, or B, to make the trade-offs, the look at the marketplace to say which pieces really should be on military satellites and which pieces should be on commercial satellites. And no one agency is looking at that holistically from a high level. And so even if you go to a single agency that is responsible for looking at that, nobody's suggesting that we still shouldn't build satellites and therefore SMC is out of a job, and nobody's suggesting that we don't go and procure commercial bandwidth and therefore this is out of a job. They're still vital components of the overall picture. They both perform tasks which are very, very specific, very specialized, And so you can't get away with either one. But there certainly, in my opinion, needs to be somebody looking at the picture from a higher level to say, really, should we be building 10 WGS? Should we be relying on commercial more? I think that somebody needs to be looking at that question.
Anybody else have perspective?
Yeah, I think the question of who would be in charge is an important question that will have to be resolved at some point, but the more important question is to do what? And if we believe what we say about there being sort of a defined architecture which has both commercial and MILSAT components to it, then I guess to do what is to figure out, okay, what platform, what capability should be used for the separate requirements that they deal with. And so you have to have a way to implement a single architecture. If we believe what we say, there ought to be a single architecture, then how you implemented it becomes an important execution question. Some ways are probably better than others. A lot of people have suggested Stratcom ought to do that. Maybe that's right, I don't know. I think it really is a second order question, though. The question is to do what, and what approach would they take? In the airlift mission, we used to have this problem many, many years ago. Are we going to send a dedicated C-141 mission to carry this 200 troops someplace, or are we going to lease a commercial airliner to do it? And they created a working capital fund administered by U.S. Transportation Command to resolve that on a transaction-by-transaction basis. And by the way, it enabled them to blow right by the cost comparison argument, which we always have between WGS and commercial. Nobody really cares. If you're going to move 200 troops 2,000 miles, there's a ton-mile cost associated with that. There's a general market price to do that. And that's the price you charge the U.S. Army to move those 200 troops, whether you do it on a C-17 or whether you do it on a leased DC-8. Doesn't matter. You've got a working capital fund. You have a way to administer a combined architecture. So we need something like that. Congress is looking at that. Other people are looking at it. But the real question is to do what? It's not who does it. We can figure out who does it. A lot of different people can probably do it, but they have to have some tools and they have to have a mission to execute. If you create a trade space where you can put commercial and government-owned systems in the same trade space and then make rational decisions as you go about what's the most appropriate to use based on cost, risk, the environment they're going to operate in, then you've really achieved something.
Warren, not to expand on your question, but there's another angle to this as well, which is the terminal component, where the synchronization of space and terminals has been a major difficulty for the government and is a huge piece of the cost equation here. And so to just look at this as a space segment problem without understanding that the whole integrated architecture, if it involves commercial and MILSATCOM, also needs to include integration on the terminal side to make sure that all this stuff in fact works together, and the developments of those are in fact time synchronized, because today their budgets and their requirements tend to come out of different camps, and that's what leads to these problems.
Okay, I want to get one more question in before I turn it over to the audience, because we're getting short on time. I'm going to ask a hosted payload question. So, keep hitting this thing. So the former head of the hosted payload office at SMC recently projected that it'll be 3 to 5 years before the military actually utilizes its own hosted payload contracting vehicle. That's the HOPS. Does that concern any of you, or was this expected?
Yes.
Could you elaborate, please?
Yes, I do find it a little bit concerning personally. All that surprise, no. I mean, I guess my perspective is that I didn't necessarily expect the floodgates to open and see dozens of requirements pouring out the door as soon as the thing was awarded. It is disappointing to me that, with the budget constraints we have, with the question about the future architecture, and to David's point, not just in comms, but in lots of different mission areas, being sort of at question in terms of what's next. We're fully deploying our constellations of our different satellites, national systems, and there's a lot of what's next. And here's an opportunity to burn down risk, to do technology demonstrations, to do things like CHIRP and other things, augmentation, distributed architecture, and yet there seems to be little motivation or interest outside of the science community. So I'm disappointed.
Our answer, on the other hand, is no. We are neither disappointed nor surprised. Chose not to bid on HOPS. We support several of the people who did. largely because we do understand it's going to take a while for that to come about, and there's missions which may or may not naturally fit. As a commercial satellite operator, we do not make or break our business case on hosted payloads. It's nice when you have space available and it fits. That's great. I mean, today on AlphaSat, we're flying several hosted payloads, LaserCom and QV band experiments and stuff like that. There were space availables on the right side. It fit. European governments had interests. They flew it. But it does not make a significant piece of our business case, nor would it in any of our future business decisions. So we look at it as a space available kind of business. We're always open to it when these things come up, but it's not something we're really relying on.
Certainly the disappointing part is that there are many opportunities to put hosted payloads on satellites which are going to be going up. And it does take 2.5 to 3 years to build a satellite. And when you're missing opportunities, it just pushes the realization of those opportunities just so much further away. So it's disappointing that they haven't got to a point where they can utilize those hosted payloads. I think it's right. I think both Scott and Peter have articulated will get to the point where it will be exercised. But they are missing a lot of opportunities in the meantime where they could be proving certain concept and exercising the contractual variations that might apply. So it's a little disappointing from that point of view.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, I also am a little disappointed but not surprised. First of all, it's a lot harder than it looks to match up missions on a single satellite program in a constrained period of time. Commercial owner-operators move pretty quickly through their development of satellite programs. It's difficult because of the constraints the governments work under to match up in terms of time. It's also very countercultural, and what I mean by that, it's on the chirp. I'll never forget the conversations we had with our government counterparts on chirp, and we worked our way through it, but there was, okay, so when's the PDR going to be? We're going to bring 32 people to the PDR, so maybe you wait a minute, you kind of missed the fact this is a commercial contract. You're not invited to the PDR. This is our program, it's not your program, you're a passenger. And that was hard to get. We didn't say it that way, but we had to work our way through that. And that's the way it turned out, because if we'd had 32 people at the government PDR, Chirp would still be sitting out there at an orbital warehouse out of Dulles, probably. So it is countercultural, and that's hard. And my view is that we won't do very much serious in the way of hosted payloads until we exhaust all the alternatives. That means when we flat run out of money and says, you're not going to have the money to fly that unless you come up with a better way to do it, and the hosted payload then probably comes into play in a more serious way. That's essentially what happened with Chirp, by the way. The government could not fly Chirp. They didn't have the money to fly it. Nobody was going to give them a dedicated platform to fly it on. And they finally said, well, maybe we'll settle for 85% of the test requirements rather than 100% if we can do it for 15% of the cost. And that's essentially what ended up happening.
Thanks. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Yeah.
It is the gentleman who, sorry, I've got a side view of all of you, but that made the comment that protected services is the divine term. I think we're finding that DoD is increasingly open to magnifying the look on what is really protected and what isn't, which I think will help amongst some of the other solutions you've passed. So being an optimist, that's maybe a step in the right direction. The question I'd have is, as you're engaged in some of the discussions with DoD, both from some of their AOAs and some of the ways you're struggling with their business models being predictable or not, are you offering anything out of the box in terms of these new concepts of service level agreements that go beyond what I'll call the trite long lease versus short lease spot market? Are you offering anything that you can share with us in terms of an interesting business model to those SLAs?
Good question.
Yeah, I think we've been having these conversations with this customer for a long time, and it seems to me that we've talked about almost every model that you can imagine, and we've said that we'll be willing to consider just about anything, right? If it means getting the partnership, and we're willing to be a good partner. I think Philip said we should be better, and I agree that that's probably true. But a lot can be done if there is a true partnership and if it's a service level agreement, if it's allowing full portability across the fleet. I mean, some of the more interesting business models are coming out as part of the Pathfinder. It's been alluded to a couple of times now. That was not a government idea initially, although they've expanded on it considerably from where it started. But you know, the idea that they would have some sort of a hosted capability on a spacecraft, if they bought one spacecraft for each of the operators sitting up here and then had global access to the rest of their constellation, that'd be pretty powerful. So, look, I think we're open.
Anybody else? Next question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, I'm Steve Brody with the International Space University, ISU. In these forums, I generally go right towards thinking about the future, thinking about the workforce for the future. And so I'd like to ask, you know, one trend that I've seen is that the graduate programs and professional development programs ISU does, on the American side, we've reached gender parity. We essentially have as many women coming into our program as men. We're a long ways to go and with the people coming from India and China and Canada and elsewhere. But what I'd like to specifically ask, where do you see, if at all, your workforce challenges? What do you need that you're not getting? And do you see a major stumbling block in the future, or is the pipeline meeting your needs?
We'd like to see more young engineers. So, put it bluntly, like Peter's son is one and works for us, and that's great. We'd like to have more Peter's son.
He now has that on video, you know.
Right, we want to keep him around.
Well, if your question was about are we seeing enough women in the industry, the answer is still no. I'm proud to say that XStar has actually got as many women as men working in the entire company, so we've done a pretty good job. What have the rest of you been doing?
Well, I'm the only one here that works for a woman. So.
But you know, there are less women, and this is a very technical trade. Less women go into technical trades just across the world. So, and certainly there's certain cultures where women don't work at all. So we're still combating that in a lot of places around the world. But here, I think we've done a pretty good job.
Are you getting enough people just generally?
Certainly the industry's, you know, how many of us don't know everybody else in the room? Right? We all know each other, right? And you go to Europe and you have the same conversations, you go to the same cocktail parties, and it's nice to see some young people coming into the industry on occasion. I don't think we see enough of that.
Since you raised the question of education, one of the things that has bothered me for some time is what I call the on-the-job education. And one of the issues that arises from the cutback in government spending is that oftentimes it's the government space programs which involve the development of new technologies and new capabilities, you know, experiments and so forth, which really provided the opportunity for young engineers to get involved at a highly technical R&D level and to learn the skills from mentors and so forth who would have had several generations ahead of them follow that through. Today, as we see in the government marketplace, there's more focus on no new programs of record, no new starts. And what that means is that there's an aging workforce of experience and people behind them who don't have an opportunity to try that out on a new program, to become a new program manager, to go through new PDRs and CDRs, but in fact they're just sort of building more of the same. And we're going to find a place where that is going to come into imbalance, and in fact we'll have a dearth of people in that critical mid-range of experience between 5 and 15 years that have had sufficient mentoring, have had sufficient experiences to really be the ones to step up and take this on. From a commercial industry perspective, we worry about this because we share the same manufacturing base as government does. I mean, I buy my satellites from Boeing, the government buys the satellites from Boeing. It's the same group of people, and we really want to see continued investment, if the government's going to do it, in R&D, in things which might be experiments, might be one-offs, whatever, but it gives those opportunities for the young workforce to really develop those skills and to learn how to not only do the technology, but to do the program management and things that we'll all rely upon when it comes time for our next generation and the government's next generation.
Do we're over time, but I'm wondering if we have time for one or two more questions. Okay. Okay, I saw I'll get to you, Colin, but I saw a hand up over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, kind of a basic question. Bandwidth isn't, it's not fungible necessarily, and there are surge requirements and that sort of thing. But if all the commercial capacity that you guys provide to the DoD were to go away, what would be the capability of the government systems, of WGS and the other systems that provide it? In other words, what quantum of the total government requirement do the government systems fulfill, and how much do you guys, how much more is left for the commercial customers?
Common wisdom during the peak of operations in Southwest Asia and the Middle East was probably about 85%, maybe as much as 90% in Afghanistan, was commercial backbone versus WGS. That was a different point in time. There weren't as many WGSs. The total demand level was much, much higher, so there was this huge surge going on at the time. I think long-term, there's still a very substantial component of commercial. I'm not sure anybody knows exactly what it is now. It's certainly not 90-10. It may be 60-40 or 50-50 or something like that. But I don't know anybody, having said that, I don't know anybody that thinks there's going to be no demand for commercial. And in terms of some mission areas, right now, the airborne ISR mission in the theaters of operations, not necessarily the strategic mission, but the unmanned ISR missions in the theaters of operations is 100% commercial because it's all KU band. So there is no WGS KU band. So there's some mission areas where you just simply can't operate, and you won't be able to operate in the foreseeable future in other than commercial bands because that's the way the platforms are constructed. And nobody has the money, to go retrofit them or reinvent them to use WGS, even though from a user perspective, WGS is free, and they would very much like to do that.
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. I started writing about this stuff a couple of millennia ago when I was still at SpaceNews. And I wonder, there's mention, I think rightfully made, of the need for a crisis or for a senior person to have time to actually think about this and do something. Well, we had 9/11, we had the Iraq War, we've certainly had a number of crises the last few years, and not a whole lot's happened to shift the landscape. Del Bellows over in the White House, maybe he'll tell us what he's going to do. But I wonder what you think will actually move the government off its current position. What will it take?
Money or lack of. Yeah.
That's the crisis.
The budget. You can't. That's pretty hard to fix. I think so. We'll see. The next few years are going to be pretty telling, right? We have to design what's next as well. These AOAs are going on, doing the trades on that, but the decision has to be made, especially if you enter into a decadal program. You'd have to decide pretty soon.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is, right now the budget hawks have a louder voice than the defense hawks do. If there's a big enough crisis to change that, then the constraints will be reduced, and we'll start to do some things. But I think the short answer is it will take a crisis at some point.
Right, and it could look something like Asia Pacific, right? So where we have many, many less satellites in the Asia Pacific arc than we have over the Indian or Atlantic Oceans. And if something goes on out there, we could find ourselves struggling to support DoD users. And I think that will precipitate itself, and it will force some very, very hard decisions. But we'll find a way to muddle through, which is good and bad. It's good that we'll find a way to muddle through, but it's bad that we'll paper over the cracks in the wall and not fix the problem. So that's probably the likely outcome. At the end of the day is that, as Scott said, the only thing that's really going to change this is a serious lack of money, which, if that happens, we have some other bigger problems to deal with. Part of the problem, if you don't mind, part of the problem is that, if DoD is correct and they say that they spend with us as satellite operators somewhere in the region of sort of $600 to $800 million a year on satellite bandwidth, if we could save them 100% of that money, it's only $600 to $800 million a year. right? And that, in the DoD budget, is not the biggest number they have to worry about. And so that's probably a big driver behind why things will probably be very, very slow to change.
We had one question over in this corner.
Yeah, Rick Lover with Hughes Network Systems. Just wonder what the panel thinks about the DoD moving to more of a true managed services model. We talk about mill bandwidth, commercial bandwidth, the cost of bandwidth, but the issue that I see at least is the efficiency and the effectivity that the DoD uses that bandwidth. And right now, I don't think it's very effective.
Great observation. You know, today in the IT community, the government writ large has moved away from individual computers and agency data centers and so forth to actually outsourcing this stuff and putting it all in the cloud. And so cloud computing is all the rage, and they get advantage from the fact that this is a diverse and shared resource with commonly managed security and such, and saves agencies a ton of money. But it means giving up a certain amount of control to actually put that out there. But they sign an SLA and they say, look, deliver me this much storage and this much computing power. I don't really care about how it's done, where it's put, whatever. From a satellite operator perspective, we think that would be great. We'd like to see the government move away from just buying leased bandwidth as we want this much megahertz of this kind of EIRP and so forth in this corner of the world, and really move to a, look, I just want this much data delivered to this kind of an operation. And let us provide that. Because in fact, then we can pick a solution that not only matches well with the architecture we have, but also one that in fact leverages the great investments made by commercial markets to use to the greatest extent COTS and so forth that exist, so that that can be delivered at an incredibly attractive price. I think by sharing that resource, the government would find a far greater improvement in its overall price point than you'd ever find from any stretching of 1-year leases into 5-year leases. I mean, that's small change compared to what they could get by going to managed services.
Okay, I think that's just going to have to do it. I would like to thank the WSBR for having this and for having me moderate, and thank Boeing again for sponsoring the webcast, and that'll be up on our website on Monday if I understand correctly. So please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause.